It started as a whisper, something so quiet I nearly ignored it. But over time, it grew louder, clawing its way into my consciousness, leaving me more unsettled than I cared to admit. My best friend, Nina, had always been close to me, closer than anyone else. We'd shared everything since college, secrets, dreams, our lives. And she was part of my life with Jack, my husband. It was just natural. Nina was always there, at every party, every get-together. She'd laugh at his jokes, lean a little too close, and playfully touch his arm. It felt innocent, at least at first. But then I started noticing little things, and a chill would run down my spine when I caught her watching him in ways I never had before. It wasn't the look of a friend admiring someone else's happiness, it was the look of a woman who wanted to be the one making him smile. Every time Jack and I shared an inside joke or even a quiet glance, I felt her eyes on us, on him. And for the first time, I felt a simmering tension. It was jealousy, plain and simple. She hid it well, buried under her usual charm and warmth, but it was there. And maybe, I began to realize, it had been there for a while, festering in silence. The realization weighed on me, but a deeper discomfort took hold of me as well. My relationship with Jack had fallen into a comfortable, almost stagnant rhythm. There wasn't anything wrong, exactly, but we had settled. And with Nina's presence, so effortlessly vibrant, so hungry for the same affection I once had, I felt something in me flicker, an old insecurity I thought I'd long ago overcome. I saw myself through Nina's eyes, and I didn't like what I saw, a woman who had given up trying, who had stopped feeling like the center of attention. Without quite planning it, I decided to test myself. I needed to know I still mattered, that I was still desirable. There was a man at work, Daniel, who had always been pleasant to me, a bit friendlier than most. He was tall, with kind eyes and a sense of humor that made the long days easier. And while I'd never thought of him as anything more than a colleague, I noticed the little thrill in his gaze when he talked to me. It was flattering. And with Nina's shadow hanging over me, that little spark felt like exactly what I needed. It began innocently enough. I'd let my laughter linger a little longer at his jokes, lean in a little closer when he spoke. He noticed, of course, he wasn't oblivious. The more I played with that line between friendliness and flirtation, the more his gaze held something warm, something undeniably inviting. And I drank it up, feeling years younger, a little more alive each time. One evening, after a particularly long day, we found ourselves alone in the office. The air was thick with the quietness of the empty building, and without thinking, I asked if he wanted to grab a drink. It was meant to be casual, just a harmless way to end the day. But as the night unfolded, as laughter and wine blurred into soft glances and hands that lingered a bit too long, I knew I was on dangerous ground. My heart pounded with every word, with every touch, a quiet rebellion against the safe, predictable life I'd let settle around me. Daniel made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. He noticed little things, how I laughed, the way my eyes lit up when I was passionate about something. It was exhilarating, intoxicating even, and I could feel myself drifting further, letting the game become something I couldn't easily control. That first night, when he leaned in, his lips so close to mine, I felt my resolve waver, the boundaries I'd promised myself melting away. And as I pulled back, my heart raced with both fear and thrill. I hadn't crossed the line yet, but I knew it was close, and part of me wasn't sure I wanted to stop. Back at home, I found myself watching Jack in a new light, noticing things I hadn't seen before, the way he'd absently scroll through his phone during dinner, how he'd barely look at me while he spoke. And it stung, knowing that the man who had once made me feel like the most beautiful woman in the world had slowly let his attention drift away. I blamed Nina, in part. Her presence seemed to magnify every flaw in our marriage, every small distance that had grown between us. But Daniel was different. He was something new, something untouched by my life with Jack or my friendship with Nina. He made me feel vibrant, wanted. And in that fragile sense of longing, I let myself believe that the connection between us was somehow justified, a balm for the wounds I felt both Nina and Jack had left. The weeks wore on, and what started as a fleeting flirtation deepened. With each glance, each shared laugh, I felt my desire grow, a need to feel fully seen, to reclaim the part of myself I had buried under years of routine and familiarity. Eventually, Daniel and I shared a kiss, soft but charged with every unspoken word, every unmet need. And in that moment, I felt a thrill like nothing else. But the guilt crashed over me afterward, sharp and relentless. I couldn't look at myself the same way. Each time I saw Nina, a tightness gripped my chest, knowing that she, in her own way, had driven me to this, but that I had let myself go too far. I hadn't crossed the line completely, but I had toyed with it, held it close enough to feel its heat. One day, I saw Nina looking at me, her gaze lingering with a strange curiosity, perhaps even suspicion. She must have sensed the shift in me, the small changes I hadn't been able to hide. It was then I realized how fragile everything had become. This game had brought me close to something I couldn't undo, something that could shatter not only my marriage but the friendship I had once cherished. Standing at a crossroads, I finally saw how much I had risked for a fleeting sense of validation. I had let my jealousy of Nina, my frustration with Jack, and my need for attention drive me into a darkness I wasn't sure I could easily escape. And in that moment, I knew that no flirtation, no secret thrill was worth the years I had built with the people who, despite everything, still meant everything to me. Slowly, painfully, I pulled back from Daniel, allowing our connection to fade into a memory. And with every small effort to rebuild the trust I'd almost destroyed, I began to see myself again, not through Nina's eyes or Jack's absence, but as someone who had faltered yet was willing to find her way back. The road to healing wouldn't be easy. But I knew it was the only path worth taking. As the days passed, I struggled with the weight of what I had almost done. The memory of that kiss with Daniel haunted me, lingering in my mind like a ghost that refused to leave. I could feel his warmth, the way his hand had rested on mine, and the depth in his eyes that I'd so willingly fallen into. And yet, for all the comfort and thrill that moment had brought, it had left behind a raw, unsettling emptiness. Jack hadn't noticed anything, at least, not consciously. But I could tell something was different in the way he looked at me, like he was searching for a connection that had grown brittle. Guilt gnawed at me, making it harder to meet his gaze without feeling a flash of shame. I found myself pulling away, not physically but emotionally, as if by putting distance between us, I could avoid facing the truth. He hadn't done anything wrong, but I felt I had betrayed him just by letting my thoughts drift to someone else, by letting my heart linger in the shadow of a moment that should never have happened. Nina, on the other hand, became more present in our lives. She was always inviting herself over, suggesting dinners, or dropping by unannounced. I couldn't tell if it was just her way of holding on to her place in our world, or if she sensed the strain growing between Jack and me. The thought of her knowing, even partially, filled me with panic. She had been there for so many of our happiest moments, a witness to the beginning of our relationship and every milestone after. Now, whenever I saw her, it felt like she was a stranger. I could see her jealousy plainly, no longer masked by laughter or playful banter. It was in the way she spoke to him, in the slight edge to her words when she talked about her own life, her own loneliness. The resentment she felt towards me simmered just below the surface, and the worst part was that I couldn't blame her. She had always wanted what I had, and perhaps, without realizing it, I had taken it for granted. The situation weighed heavily on me, and I couldn't bear it any longer. I knew I had to confront the distance growing between Jack and me, even if it meant facing the truth of my own failings. One evening, as we sat at the dinner table in silence, I mustered the courage to bring it up. My heart raced as I searched for the right words, but everything felt clumsy, inadequate. "Jack," I began, my voice barely a whisper, do you feel like something's off between us?" He looked up from his plate, surprise flickering in his eyes. For a moment, he seemed to consider my question, as if weighing his own response. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice cautious but not unkind. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every choice I had made pressing down on me. "I just feel like we're not the same as we used to be." I struggled to articulate the words, to capture the emptiness I felt inside. "I miss the way we used to be." Before life got so routine. Jack set his fork down and leaned back, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. He didn't respond right away, and the silence between us felt like a chasm, too vast and too deep to cross. "I've felt it too," he finally admitted. "But I thought maybe it was just life. Work, responsibilities, all of it. I thought it was normal." Hearing him say it out loud brought a strange relief, but it also shattered something in me. It was as if we had both been tiptoeing around the truth, too afraid to face it head-on. We talked that night, more honestly than we had in years, about our fears, our insecurities, and the slow drift that had come between us. I told him how I had felt invisible, how I had longed for the attention he once gave me. I didn't tell him about Daniel, but the guilt still weighed on me, a silent confession that hovered in the air between us. Jack listened, really listened, in a way I hadn't felt in years. He didn't try to justify or dismiss my feelings, he simply heard me, and for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope. We both agreed that we needed to make an effort to reconnect, to find each other again in the small, everyday moments that we had allowed to slip by unnoticed. It was a promise, fragile but sincere, and I clung to it as if it were a lifeline. But as much as I wanted to move forward, I couldn't shake the lingering presence of Nina. She was still there, woven into the fabric of our lives, and I knew that I needed to confront her as well. The tension between us had become almost unbearable, a silent battle that played out in every glance, every half-smile. One afternoon, I asked her to meet me for coffee, determined to finally address the unspoken distance between us. When she arrived, she looked surprised but curious, her usual confidence replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. We sat across from each other, the air thick with everything we hadn't said. For a moment, I didn't know where to start, but then the words began to spill out, raw and unfiltered. "Nina, I feel like things have changed between us," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I feel like you're angry with me, and I don't even know why." She looked at me, her gaze steady but guarded. "Maybe it's because you have everything I ever wanted," she replied, her words laced with a bitterness that caught me off guard. "You have Jack, this perfect life, and I'm just there, watching from the sidelines." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had always known, on some level, that Nina envied parts of my life, but I had never realized the depth of her resentment. And hearing it now, spoken so bluntly, made me question everything I thought I knew about our friendship. "Nina, I had no idea," I whispered, feeling a wave of guilt wash over me. "I never meant to make you feel that way. You're my best friend. I thought we shared everything." She laughed, a hollow, bitter sound that seemed to echo in the quiet of the cafe. Maybe that was the problem. I thought if I stayed close enough, if I just waited, somehow it would be my turn. Her words hung heavy between us, a confession that revealed the cracks in our friendship that I had been too blind to see. I realized then that our bond had been built on an illusion, a delicate balance that had tipped into something dark and twisted. And in that moment, I saw that our friendship was as fragile as my marriage, held together by secrets and unspoken resentments. I don't know how long we sat there, each lost in our own thoughts, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us. I felt a deep sadness settle over me, knowing that I couldn't fix this, that I couldn't change the choices that had led us to this point. And as I looked at Nina, I saw the hurt in her eyes, the years of jealousy and longing that had finally spilled over, shattering the illusion of our perfect friendship. When we finally parted ways, I felt a strange sense of closure, but also an aching emptiness. I knew that things would never be the same between us, that our friendship had been irrevocably altered. And as I walked away, I felt the weight of my actions, the choices that had brought me to this moment. I had almost lost everything, my marriage, my friendship, my sense of self, all for a fleeting need to feel wanted, to feel seen. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding, on finding a new way forward with Jack, on rediscovering the parts of myself that I had let slip away. It wasn't easy, some days, the guilt and regret felt overwhelming. But slowly, bit by bit, I began to heal, to forgive myself for the mistakes I had made. And as for Nina, we drifted apart, our lives taking separate paths. I still thought of her sometimes, wondered if she had found her own happiness, her own sense of fulfillment. But I knew that our friendship had been a chapter in my life that had reached its natural end, a lesson learned through heartbreak and self-discovery. Looking back, I realized that envy and desire had been powerful forces, capable of tearing apart even the strongest bonds. But they had also taught me something important, that true happiness could only come from within, from embracing the life I had built, with all its imperfections. And in that hard-won wisdom, I found a peace I hadn't felt in years, a quiet strength that reminded me of who I truly was. The weeks passed, but Nina's absence left an undeniable void. The quiet that had settled in my life was both a relief and a constant reminder of all the things I'd lost. Without her, my days felt unanchored. She had been a part of my world for so long that I sometimes found myself instinctively reaching for my phone to text her, only to remember, with a sharp pang, that things would never be the same. I was the one who had called her out, had started the conversation that tore apart the thin veil between us, but it still felt like she'd left me behind. There were days when I'd catch myself replaying our conversations, wondering if I had missed the signs earlier, if there was a point where things could have gone differently. I realized that in my need for validation, I had overlooked her silent struggles. Maybe she'd seen my happiness as a constant reminder of what she thought she'd never have. I wondered, with a mixture of guilt and regret, if I had somehow flaunted my life in her face without realizing it, rubbing salt into wounds I never knew existed. Jack and I tried to fill the emptiness left by her departure. We went out more, spent evenings talking about the future, even brought back some of the small traditions we'd abandoned over the years. We'd cook together on weekends, taking turns picking out recipes, laughing as we fumbled through new dishes that sometimes turned out disastrously. There was a comfort in the simplicity of these moments, a quiet intimacy that had been lost in the busyness of daily life. It was as though, by stripping away everything else, we were finally able to focus on each other. But in the back of my mind, there was always the lingering shadow of Daniel. I had cut things off between us abruptly, retreating into a polite but firm distance that was impossible to ignore. He had respected my decision, though I could see the hurt in his eyes whenever we crossed paths. I knew he was just as aware as I was of the unspoken tension that now hung between us, a constant reminder of the line we'd crossed. One evening, as I left the office late, I found him waiting near the elevator, his face shadowed by a mixture of sadness and something else, something unresolved. The elevator doors closed around us, and the silence was deafening. I avoided his gaze, willing myself to stay strong, to not let the emotional tug pull me back into the feelings I'd tried so hard to put away. But as the floors ticked by, he finally spoke, his voice low, almost hesitant. "Did I mean anything to you?" His question hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath, steadying myself. "Yes," I replied softly. "You did. But it wasn't real, Daniel. It was something I thought I needed, but it wasn't what I wanted." He looked at me, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought he would argue, try to convince me otherwise. But instead, he nodded, a quiet resignation settling over him. "I hope you find what you're looking for," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. When the doors opened, I walked away without looking back, feeling the weight of our brief connection finally lift. It was a bittersweet relief, like a page turned in a book I knew I'd never revisit. I knew then that I had made the right decision, that holding on to that fleeting thrill would have cost me more than I was willing to pay. Yet, even as I tried to move forward, I couldn't fully shake the sense of loss. I missed the version of myself I had been with Daniel, the woman who had laughed freely, who had felt seen and desired. But I also knew that version of me was built on a fragile illusion, one that couldn't survive the reality of my life with Jack. And as I watched Jack rebuild his trust in me, investing time and energy into rekindling what we'd once had, I felt a sense of gratitude mixed with a pang of guilt that lingered just beneath the surface. Months passed, and Nina remained a distant memory, a shadow from another life. But one evening, as I was browsing through old photos, I stumbled upon a picture of the three of us, taken years ago at a summer barbecue. We were laughing, arms around each other, our faces lit with the easy joy of shared friendship. Seeing her face again, so full of life, brought an ache to my chest. I wondered if she ever looked back on these moments too, if she felt the same sense of loss that I did. Then, unexpectedly, I received a message from her one evening. It was brief, almost formal, asking if I would be open to meeting her for coffee. I stared at the message, my heart pounding. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let the silence between us remain undisturbed. But another part of me, the part that remembered all the good we'd shared, felt a pull to say yes. After all, we had been like sisters once, and perhaps there was something left to salvage. When we met, there was an awkwardness between us, a tension that neither of us knew how to bridge. We sat in silence for a while, each of us unsure how to begin. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer than I remembered. "I've missed you," she admitted, looking down at her hands. I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. "I've missed you too." There was a pause, and then she looked up, her gaze steady. "I was angry, you know. Not just at you, but at everything. My life didn't turn out the way I thought it would. And seeing you and Jack, it was like watching someone else live the life I thought I'd have." Her honesty was disarming, and I felt my own walls start to crumble. "I didn't realize how much you were struggling," I said quietly. "I should have been there for you, but I was too wrapped up in my own insecurities." She smiled, a small, sad smile that spoke of shared regret. "Maybe we both were," she said. "I think I put so much of my happiness into this idea of what life should look like, and when I didn't get it, well, I let it turn into something ugly." For a long time, we just sat there, each of us processing the truths that had been left unsaid for so long. We didn't make any promises that day, didn't try to fix things overnight. But we both left with a sense of understanding, a fragile truce that held the possibility of healing. I didn't know if we would ever be as close as we once were, but there was a peace in knowing that the bitterness between us had finally been laid to rest. As the years went by, Jack and I continued to rebuild, taking small steps each day to keep our marriage alive and resilient. We learned to communicate better, to share our fears and insecurities before they could fester. It wasn't always easy. There were days when old habits resurfaced, when the weight of everything we'd been through felt too heavy to bear. But we kept trying, kept choosing each other, and in that choice, I found a strength I hadn't known before. Nina and I kept in touch sporadically, exchanging messages here and there, sometimes meeting up for a quick coffee or a brief chat. Our friendship had changed irrevocably, but there was a quiet respect between us, a mutual understanding that, despite everything, we had once been a significant part of each other's lives. And perhaps that was enough. Looking back, I realized that my journey had taught me more than I could have imagined. I had learned about the dangers of envy, the seductive power of validation, and the importance of staying true to myself even when it felt easier to seek comfort elsewhere. Most of all, I had learned that happiness wasn't something that could be found in the eyes of others, it was something I had to nurture within myself, one small moment at a time. In the end, life didn't turn out the way I had once imagined, with the perfect friendships and the flawless marriage. It was messier, more complicated, but also richer and deeper in ways I hadn't expected. And as I looked at the life Jack and I had rebuilt together, I felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense of peace that came from knowing I had faced my own weaknesses and emerged stronger on the other side. The scars were still there, faint reminders of everything we'd been through, but they no longer held power over me. They were simply part of the story, a testament to the journey we had taken. And as I looked at the life I had now, a life filled with love, growth, and a newfound resilience, I realized that, for the first time in a long time, I was truly content. The years continued to unfold, and life settled into a gentle, steady rhythm. Jack and I found a balance, a new depth in our marriage that felt more real and grounded than the idealistic love we'd once clung to. It was a love that had been tested and had survived, a love that held both forgiveness and the quiet promise of moving forward. But while I cherished the life we were building, there were days when the past would creep back in, unexpectedly, like the lingering ache of an old wound. Sometimes it was just a scent that would take me back to that fleeting affair with Daniel, or a chance encounter with Nina in town that left me feeling unsettled. These moments reminded me that the choices I'd made had left lasting marks, not only on my relationships but on me as a person. In one of these moments, when I was feeling particularly vulnerable, I found myself wondering if Jack ever thought about my distance during that period, if he had sensed more than he let on. One evening, as we were relaxing on the couch, I gathered the courage to ask, my voice quiet in the dim light of the living room. "Jack, do you ever think about those rough patches we went through? The times when I pulled away?" My question hung in the air, fragile and uncertain. He looked at me, a softness in his gaze that I hadn't expected. He took my hand, gently squeezing it, and nodded. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted. "But I don't hold on to it. I know that we were both struggling, and I could see that you were carrying a lot on your shoulders." He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. I knew something was off, but I figured, if I just gave you space, you'd find your way back. And you did. His response filled me with both relief and a bittersweet understanding. Jack had always been more patient, more forgiving, than I had deserved in those moments. His quiet strength and loyalty had been the foundation on which I'd found my way back. I leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his embrace, a reminder of all we had overcome. As the months passed, I threw myself into new projects at work, immersing myself in a role that I had previously approached with little more than casual interest. This was something I did for me, a way to find fulfillment that wasn't tied to anyone else. I realized that part of my restlessness, the dissatisfaction that had once driven me toward Daniel, stemmed from my own lack of purpose. Rediscovering my passions, allowing myself to grow independently of my relationships, brought a new energy to my life, one that no fleeting romance or external validation could replace. One morning, while I was organizing files at the office, I came across a small, forgotten memento that Daniel had given me. It was just a pen, but I remembered the day he'd left it on my desk, an excuse to strike up a conversation. Holding it now, I felt a sense of closure, a quiet acceptance that the person I'd been then no longer existed. I put the pen in a drawer, a simple gesture of leaving the past behind. The pull toward him was gone, replaced by a feeling of peace. With time, Nina and I established a tentative friendship, though it was different than before. Our coffee meetings were less frequent, more careful, as if we both understood that there were lines we couldn't cross. She had met someone new, a kind, grounded man named Matt who seemed to genuinely adore her. Hearing her talk about him brought a strange comfort. I wanted her to be happy, to find the kind of stability and love that she'd once envied in me. I wished her well, truly, even as I felt the natural distance between us grow. Our friendship became something softer, a gentle echo of what it once had been. We'd text from time to time, sharing news or checking in, but we both understood that we had reached the end of that chapter. Perhaps that's just how life works. Some relationships are meant to fade, to leave room for new growth. I found myself looking back on our shared years with gratitude rather than sadness, seeing them as an important part of my journey, but also one that had served its purpose. And then, one autumn afternoon, something happened that tested the stability I'd worked so hard to rebuild. I was at a charity event organized by my company when I saw Daniel across the room. It had been years, and yet there he was, a familiar figure in a sea of strangers. He looked different, older, maybe a bit tired, but there was still that familiar charm in his expression. Our eyes met briefly, and for a moment, I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't longing, exactly, but rather a bittersweet acknowledgement of the person I'd once been, the woman who had felt so lost and had reached out for comfort in the wrong place. Daniel approached, his smile gentle, and we exchanged a few polite words about work and life. There was an unspoken understanding between us, a recognition of what we had shared and the quiet relief that it was firmly in the past. As we said our goodbyes, I felt a sense of finality, as if I'd closed a door that I had unknowingly left ajar. I left that event feeling lighter, grateful for the stability I'd found with Jack, for the life we'd chosen to rebuild together. Jack noticed the change in me that evening, a subtle shift in my demeanor. He didn't ask what had happened, didn't press for details. Instead, he simply pulled me into his arms, and we stood there, holding each other, letting the silence between us speak of everything we'd been through. It was a moment of pure connection, a reminder of the journey we'd taken together, and the quiet strength we'd built in the process. Over the years, I found myself growing into a different version of myself, one who was no longer defined by past mistakes or insecurities. I began to take joy in the simple things, in the quiet moments that once would have seemed too ordinary. I found happiness in cooking dinner together, in the long walks we took on weekends, in the shared silences that held a comfort words could never express. Jack and I were not the same people we'd once been, but we were stronger, more resilient, and more deeply connected than ever before. And while the shadows of the past still lingered, they had lost their power over me. I had learned to live with them, to accept them as part of the journey that had led me here. The regrets, the broken friendships, the near mistakes, all of them had been stepping stones, lessons that had shaped the person I had become. I had come to understand that life isn't about perfect happiness or flawless love, it's about growth, resilience, and the quiet, steadfast commitment to the people we choose to keep in our lives. Looking back, I could see that everything, the envy, the mistakes, the broken friendships, had led me to a place of peace, a place where I could finally embrace who I was without longing for something else. And as I stood by Jack's side, watching our lives unfold in gentle, beautiful moments, I knew that I had finally found the happiness I had once been so desperate to chase. It was here all along, in the life we had built, in the love that had weathered every storm. And for that, I was endlessly grateful. Years continued to pass, and my life took on a gentle, steady cadence that felt earned. My relationship with Jack had transformed into something deep and abiding, like an ancient oak, strong and resilient after withstanding years of wind and storms. It was a love that I no longer questioned, a love that wasn't about fiery passion or grand gestures, but about presence, stability, and the choice we made every day to be there for each other. In the quiet of our routine, I found new joy. The little moments that I had once overlooked, Jack reading on the couch in his favorite sweater, the two of us laughing over the burnt toast I'd forgotten in the oven, even the small shared grumbles over bills and grocery lists, these things became the markers of a life that felt full. I had stopped searching for excitement outside of what we had. Instead, I learned to see the beauty in the everyday, in the ways we supported and uplifted each other. It was a life that didn't feel perfect, but it was real, and it was ours. Despite the sense of peace I had found, I still carried the lessons of my past. Occasionally, memories would resurface, fleeting thoughts of Daniel, the slight pangs of nostalgia for the deep friendship I'd once had with Nina, even flashes of the woman I had been in those lost years when I'd searched for validation in all the wrong places. These memories no longer brought guilt or regret, but a gentle reminder of how far I had come. They were parts of me, pieces that had shaped who I was and the life I had fought to rebuild. And I understood now that those moments had been necessary for my growth, painful though they were. One autumn day, I received an unexpected message from Nina. It was brief, straightforward, and somehow tender, inviting me to her wedding. I stared at her message, feeling a swirl of emotions that surprised me. There was happiness for her, of course. I knew how much she had yearned for a stable, loving relationship, and I hoped that Matt was the one who could give her that. But there was also a lingering sadness, an awareness that she and I had drifted so far apart that we now felt like strangers. I felt grateful that she had thought of me, and maybe, in some way, this invitation was her way of acknowledging the past we had shared. On the day of her wedding, I found myself nervous, unsure of how to approach her, unsure of how to fit into her new world. Jack held my hand as we entered the beautiful vineyard where the ceremony was taking place, and I was reminded of how different our lives had become. I saw Nina from a distance, radiant in her dress, a softness in her expression that I hadn't seen before. She looked happy, truly happy, and it warmed something in me to see her that way. I remembered the envy that had once simmered between us, the silent comparisons we'd made, and in that moment, it felt like all of it had faded away. I no longer felt any of the old jealousy or resentment. I felt a quiet contentment, a sense of completion. When she spotted me across the room, she came over, her face lighting up with a genuine smile. "Thank you for coming," she said, and for the first time in years, there was no pretense in her voice, no hidden edge. It was just us, two women who had once been like sisters, finally at peace. "Congratulations, Nina," I said, my voice catching slightly. "You look incredible." Her eyes softened, and she gave a small nod. "Thank you." "I'm really happy," she said, almost as if she needed to hear it herself. And in that moment, I knew she meant it. There was no room left for the old bitterness between us, no space for the comparisons and unspoken rivalries. We had both traveled our own paths, and they had led us to different places, but places where we could finally find our own happiness. After the wedding, life slipped back into its familiar patterns. I continued to grow in my career, finding satisfaction in the independence and sense of purpose it gave me. I took on new projects, pushing myself out of my comfort zone, learning to trust in my abilities and to see myself as more than just Jack's wife or Nina's friend. I had finally become my own person, someone who was proud of her own achievements, and that self-assurance began to spill into every part of my life. Jack and I began planning for the future in new ways. We talked about taking a long-awaited trip to Europe, about maybe moving to a quieter place outside the city where we could enjoy more of nature, perhaps even starting a garden. These dreams felt more grounded than the ones we had when we were younger, but they were dreams we shared, dreams that came from the life we had built together, brick by brick. One evening, as we sat on the back porch watching the sunset, Jack turned to me, a thoughtful look on his face. "I've been thinking about us," he said, his voice steady and warm. "We've been through a lot, haven't we?" I nodded, feeling the weight of those words. "We have. But I think it's made us stronger." He smiled, a smile that held years of love and understanding. "I wouldn't trade any of it," he said softly. "Even the hard parts. Especially the hard parts, actually. Because they brought us here." His words filled me with a warmth I couldn't quite put into words. We had both made mistakes, had both stumbled and found our way back to each other. And now, sitting there under the fading light, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. Gratitude for Jack's unwavering patience, for his quiet forgiveness, and for his willingness to rebuild with me. I knew that I was lucky, that not everyone found this kind of understanding and resilience in their relationships. As the years continued, Jack and I welcomed new chapters into our lives. We watched friends come and go, families grow, and new memories form around us. Our love became the quiet, steady foundation on which I built a life filled with purpose, connection, and peace. I found myself mentoring younger women at work, sharing the lessons I'd learned, hoping to guide them through the same insecurities and doubts I had once faced. It felt like a small way to give back, a way to make sense of the struggles I had endured. Occasionally, when I thought back to those years of turbulence, I felt a twinge of nostalgia, a reminder of the intense emotions, the thrill, and the raw vulnerability I'd once known. But it was no longer a longing, no longer something I chased. Instead, it was a part of me that I could look at from a distance, a memory I could acknowledge without losing myself in it. In the end, I came to see that life is not about perfection or constant happiness. It's about resilience, about finding beauty in the broken places, about embracing the journey with all of its messiness and uncertainty. I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, not to Nina, not to Jack, not to Daniel, and most importantly, not to myself. I had found a sense of fulfillment that came from within, a quiet pride in the life I had created and the woman I had become. As Jack and I grew older together, I saw our love reflected in the small moments, his hand resting on mine during a long drive, the way he would bring me tea without asking, the laughter we shared over things that only we understood. We didn't need grand gestures or constant excitement, we had something deeper, something that had weathered storms and had emerged stronger for it. And as I looked at the life we had built, the love we had cultivated, I knew that this was my happy ending. Not the one I had dreamed of in my youth, not the fairy tale of perfection I had once imagined, but something far richer and more enduring. It was a life that held both joy and sorrow, beauty and hardship, but most importantly, it was real. And for that, I was endlessly grateful. As the years unfolded, Jack and I fell into a rhythm so gentle and familiar that it almost felt like breathing. We had moved to a quiet town on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by tall pines and wide-open skies that seemed to stretch on forever. Our new home was a modest place, but it felt just right for us, a little garden out back, a fireplace in the living room, and enough space to host dinners for friends and family, but not so large that it swallowed us. We wanted a life that felt close, warm, and simple, with all the excess and noise stripped away. Living there, away from the constant hum of city life, allowed us to reconnect with the things that mattered most. We spent slow, quiet mornings sipping coffee on the porch, listening to the birds chirping, the world just beginning to stir awake. I could feel the rhythm of life settle in me, a sense of peace I'd once thought impossible. The frenzied days of questioning and longing had finally faded, replaced by something solid and enduring. Jack and I would sit there together, often in silence, the comfort of his presence filling every unspoken word between us. Our days became filled with small, cherished routines. We'd take long walks through the woods, sometimes hand in hand, other times simply side by side, each lost in thought but feeling the quiet bond that years of love had woven between us. Jack would often point out little things, a curious squirrel darting up a tree, a patch of wildflowers blooming in late spring, the changing colors of leaves in autumn. It struck me how these things, so simple and quiet, had come to mean everything. As I grew older, I found myself savoring moments with the same reverence I'd once reserved for grand occasions. I no longer craved the drama of my younger years, the thrill of unknown possibilities or the urge to test my boundaries. Instead, I took joy in baking fresh bread in the mornings, in the smell of rain-soaked earth, in the way Jack's face would light up when he saw me waiting for him after a day's work in the garden. These were the small, ordinary things that I had once overlooked, but now, they filled my heart in a way I could never have predicted. Over time, our circle of friends grew closer, tighter. We found ourselves hosting dinners where laughter would echo late into the night, where conversations would flow freely, and the worries of everyday life seemed to melt away. There was a sense of contentment in those gatherings, a feeling that we were exactly where we were meant to be. Nina and I still kept in touch, though our conversations were rare and infrequent. She had built a life of her own with Matt, and from what little I knew, she was happy. Occasionally, she would send me a message or a picture from a vacation, and I would respond with a few warm words. Our friendship had become like a quiet echo, something that lingered but no longer played a central role in my life. I no longer felt any resentment or pain when I thought of her, only a quiet, detached fondness, like remembering an old song from a different time. Jack and I would often talk about what our future might hold, about how we wanted to spend our remaining years. We dreamed of small things, of expanding our garden, of adopting a rescue dog, of taking a trip to Italy that we had talked about for decades. These dreams felt attainable, grounded, a far cry from the fleeting ambitions of my past. And I knew that, unlike the desires that had once driven me toward restlessness, these dreams came from a place of contentment rather than longing. One spring afternoon, as we were planting new flowers in the garden, Jack turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about what you would have done differently?" he asked, his voice soft, almost hesitant. I paused, feeling the weight of his question settle over me. There were certainly moments I could have chosen differently, times when I could have been more patient, more open, more trusting. There were times I could have walked away from the mistakes I made, from the lapses in judgment that had almost cost us everything. But as I looked at Jack, at the life we had built together, I knew that every twist and turn had brought us to this place. "No," I said, shaking my head gently. "I don't think I would. Because if I did, we might not be here now. And here is exactly where I want to be." He smiled, his eyes warm with understanding, and he reached over to brush a stray hair from my face. In that moment, I felt a deep sense of love and gratitude, knowing that despite everything, we had found our way back to each other. There was a resilience in our love, a quiet strength that had been forged in the fires of doubt and regret. We had emerged from those years of uncertainty with something precious, something that could only be earned by facing our shadows and choosing, again and again, to come back to each other. As time wore on, I began to see the marks of age in both of us, the laugh lines that crinkled at the corners of Jack's eyes, the silver that had woven itself into his hair. I saw my own face change too, saw the reflections of a life lived deeply and fully in the mirror each morning. These changes didn't frighten me, rather, they reminded me of all we had shared, of the joy and sorrow, the mistakes and the hard-won peace that had shaped us into who we were. Occasionally, when we spent time with younger friends or relatives, they would ask us about the secret to a lasting marriage, about how we had managed to stay together despite everything we'd been through. I never had a simple answer, but I would tell them that the key was forgiveness, not just for each other, but for ourselves. I had learned to forgive myself for the moments of weakness, for the times I had let my fears and insecurities lead me astray. And I had forgiven Jack for the times he had unknowingly hurt me, for the times when his own silence had left me feeling lost. In the end, it was this mutual forgiveness that had allowed us to keep going, to keep choosing each other, even when it was difficult. In our later years, we found new passions, new ways to keep our lives full and meaningful. Jack took up woodworking, crafting small pieces of furniture for friends and family, while I joined a local book club, finding joy in the simple pleasure of discussing stories and ideas with others. We continued to travel, ticking off destinations one by one, each trip a reminder that life was meant to be savored, that even in our older age, there was so much left to explore and experience. Eventually, our small house became a gathering place for family and friends, a place where memories were made and laughter lingered long after everyone had left. We watched as the people around us grew, as children became adults, as the seasons changed. And through it all, we remained together, each day a quiet testament to the love that had withstood every storm. Looking back, I realized that life had given me everything I needed, not in the form of grand accomplishments or picture-perfect happiness, but in the quiet, enduring love that had carried me through. I had learned that true contentment came not from external validation or fleeting moments of excitement, but from the deep, unshakable sense of belonging that I had found with Jack. In the end, I understood that happiness is not a destination, not a prize to be won, but a choice we make every day, a choice to embrace the imperfect, to forgive, to let go of what no longer serves us. And as I sat with Jack on the porch in the early mornings, our hands entwined, watching the sun rise over the quiet landscape that had become our home, I knew that I had found everything I had ever needed right there beside me.